Hi, this is Katie from wellnessmama.com. Today I'm interviewing Tim Ferriss about his new book, The 4-Hour Chef, which is much more than a basic cookbook, but I'll let you see that for yourself. Here's the full trailer and then we'll jump right into the interview. So hi Tim, thanks for agreeing to an interview. I actually finished reading The 4-Hour Chef last night. I'm amazed how much you crammed into a book and how you use cooking as an analogy for everything. To start off, for anyone who isn't familiar with you or your books, can you give us a little bit about who you are, how you ended up writing the 3 books that you've written, and why someone should apply your ideas?
No problem. Thank you for having me. Of course, my pleasure. My name is Tim Ferriss. I wrote the 4-Hour Workweek, which was turned down by 26 publishers and then hit New York Times and stayed there for 4.5 years. It was in about 35 languages. So that's about elegant solutions to time management and reclaiming time. Elegant solutions to career and business, I suppose. A lot of case studies. Then the 4-Hour Body was the second book, which did not get turned down by 26 publishers. It debuted at #1 and really had to do with the identifying the simplest paths from A to B for everything physical, whether that was sleep, sex, fat loss, endurance, and so forth. And then the most recent book, The 4-Hour Chef, is kind of like Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance in the sense that it's a cookbook for all skills disguised as a cookbook for food. And spent the last 2 years finding the world's fastest learners and best chefs and looking at accelerated learning and accelerated cooking. And so that is the latest book. Why you should apply it? Very good question. Because I would say, particularly in this book, I started off as a complete non-cook. The only thing I could cook was liquid egg whites in plastic containers in a microwave, if you can believe that. And I tried everything myself. I traveled around the world. I tested everything and had some of the best coaches and chefs in the world as my teachers. And I think fortunately, I had the luck of discovering a lot of shortcuts and a lot of principles that save a lot of time and a lot of headache. So I would say those are a few reasons to come to mind.
Awesome. So I know, at least for me, it was a new idea, or at least a new term, when I first read the 4-Hour Workweek, meta-learning. So can you
Yep.
please explain what meta-learning is and how you use it to maximize your efficiency and minimize the time taken in learning a new skill?
Yeah, absolutely. So the term meta basically just means up and above, right? So if you have, let's say, a scientific study, sometimes you'll see what's called a meta study, and the meta study looks at all of the studies. So learning, we usually think of learning like I'm going to learn a language, I'm going to learn to dance salsa, I'm going to learn whatever it might be. And meta learning is just the skill of acquiring skill. So learning how to learn as quickly as possible, and that's what I've sort of looked at ever since college, actually, where I was in neuroscience originally. So in terms of the applications, you could take something, look at a myth, right? A myth like you should learn languages as you learn a language as a baby, or that adults learn languages slower than children. Not true. Neither of them are true, and it doesn't take a lifetime to become conversationally fluent in, let's say, Spanish. You could do it in 8 to 12 weeks if you approach it the right way. And so that's the recipe that I talk about in the book that applies to all things.
Okay. So I know you mentioned Pareto's principle or the 80-20 rule in all three of your books.
Hmm.
And so simplified, that's that 80% of the effects or the results usually come from 20% of the input or causes. But can you explain this in more detail and give some examples of how you've used it in your own life?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 80-20 principle or the Pareto's law is a really important concept to understand. It just means that the minority of your activities or relationships create 80% of the outcomes, the results that you want. Similarly, if you're looking at, let's say, business, 20% or less of the customers and services, products that you offer are probably also creating 80% of the headache and consuming 80% or more of your time. So you can use it in very flexible ways, all the way from sort of career and making decisions about what to focus on or what not to do. Also, certainly with the human body, determining that, let's just say, for women, certainly, if you were going to pick one exercise of all exercises available, the kettlebell swing, the two-handed kettlebell swing, will get you, 90% of the results that you would get from everything else combined. And we've seen a number of case studies. Mothers of two have lost 120, 130 pounds just doing the two-handed kettlebell swing, which is pretty cool. Then, as it relates to cooking, certainly the same thing. So you could look at, let's say, the gear, right, the equipment needed in the kitchen. So what are the select few that allow me to do the most? And you can pick gear appropriate that you might only see in professional kitchens that, for whatever reason, home cooks just don't use very much, like pastry scrapers, which cost like $4, like a microplane, which is a type of grater that costs probably $12, like Kunrikon peelers, which are super cheap. You can get 3 of them for $10, and then of course also you can look at cooking technique. So I actually looked at the question posed to world-class chefs. If you could only take one cooking method with you to a desert island for the rest of your life, what would you choose and why? And 2 of the results that came back pretty consistently were braising and grilling, right? And so I decided, all right, well, if we applied the 80-20 rule to cooking, we should focus first on those 2 skills because they're really flexible and you can apply them to thousands of dishes, dozens of cuisines, and so forth and so on. Even if you're learning knife skills, which is really intimidating to people. And I think, like a lot of people, my mom had given me a knife or two when I graduated from school and went out into the big world, and I never ever really used them. I mean, they just kind of sat in the block like a piece of furniture. And even learning knife skills, you can determine what the 3 or 4 principles are that you need to learn, and then literally within a weekend you can be cutting an onion while talking to a friend and not even looking at what you're cutting. It's pretty cool stuff.
Awesome. So the majority of my readers are moms and wives, and a lot of us also work. So for us, maximizing efficiency is not even a luxury, but it's more of a necessity if we want to have any quality time at all. So like personally, I cook 3 meals from scratch for 6 people every day.
Mhm.
And in 4-Hour Chef, you use cooking as a way to explain how to learn anything more efficiently. So can you break that down, explain why you chose cooking to illustrate that point, and give us the basic recipe for anything to become more efficient?
Yeah, for sure. So I chose cooking for a few reasons. The first is that most people eat 3 times a day. So by learning about cooking, you just learn a lot about food, which I think allows you to see life in high definition as opposed to in black and white. Secondly, cooking was one of the few skills that had kicked my ass many times in the past. I found that there were too many things that made it inconvenient and time consuming, whether it was grocery shopping, whether it was prep time, whether it was cleanup, storage, you name it. There were just many ways that I could fail. So my goal became to remove all of those factors from cooking, at least in the beginning, so that people could have early wins and learn to love it instead of hate it. And the general process for deconstructing, or I should say, learning to cook, or any skill that I mentioned, and I talk about tango in the book and other things, is first deconstruction. So the acronym is DSSS, so DIS, deconstruction, which is breaking a skill down to its component pieces, right? So with swimming, you'd be like, all right, what are the arms doing? What are the legs doing? So breaking it down to Lego blocks like that. Then selection, which is the 80-20 process we talked about. So picking the 20% that are going to give you 80% or more of the results. Then sequence, which is putting things in the right order, so a logical progression, which would mean, for instance, like ossobuco is actually really easy to make. You could make it for 6 people, and assuming you have a Dutch oven that's big enough, like it's literally 5 minutes of prep time. It's super, super, super easy. And you take a recipe like that and put it in the very beginning, so that cleanup is minimized, everything is minimized, and then you lead up to the more complicated stuff once you get a little more excited and ambitious. So that's then the last S is stakes, and stakes is creating either a reward or a punishment for not doing something. So let's say that you decide, all right, like we always eat takeout or we always bring food in, and I want to, let's just say, cook twice a week. You could use the same thing for quitting smoking or anything, but let's say it's cooking twice a week. Well, you could create like a betting pool, or you could you could put money, even if it's like $50, $20, doesn't matter, into a service like Stick, STICKK.com, or Diet Bet is one for losing weight. And what it means is, effectively, if you don't follow your own plan, then you lose that money or you earn money. There are many different ways to do it, but creating stakes, like incentives to actually follow the program, because if you don't do your job at work, you get fired. But if you don't follow your diet, then the only person who's going to punish you typically is you. So it's really, really valuable to create stakes, even if they're very small and purely psychological. Those are a few of the things. I also get into, compressing. I take 6 months of culinary school and cram it into 48 hours. If you want to just go crazy for a weekend and try to learn as much as possible. Frequency, like how often do you want to do stuff? If let's say you're trying to learn Spanish or Japanese or whatever, like how frequently should you actually practice for the best results? And then there are all sorts of other fun tips and tricks and stuff. But that's the basic framework, and I lay it all out so it's super easy to understand.
Okay. So you mentioned you hated cooking before. So what's your outlook now? Do you cook a lot now?
It's really hysterical, because my girlfriend, I've been dating the same girl for a year and a half, as well as some of my friends, have seen me go from complete culinary idiot to cooking to relax, which is really amazing. Because my girlfriend used to ask me just to kind of, I don't know what it was, like flirt or just be together. She'd be like, "Oh, could you help me with dinner? Like, why don't you help me chop this or do that?" And I was such a total head case and nervous breakdown in the kitchen because I didn't know what I was doing. She would just kick me out. So she would be like, "Oh, could you help?" And she'd be like, "Why don't you just sit down? Why don't you just why don't you just sit down and watch TV or something, and I'll handle this." And now I can actually, I want to chop stuff. Like I find cutting vegetables like meditative, because I have my process. Like I have a method down that works every time without fail. And it's just crazy to me that I've reached that point, where I'm really not only comfortable in the kitchen, but when I go out to eat, instead of seeing things as like good, bad, hot or cold, spicy, not spicy, like I can pick out all of these individual million flavors, or colors rather, and it's really fundamentally changed my life, which is awesome, because it's like training you in the kitchen for everything outside of the kitchen, which is just great, because it's really a force multiplier, at least for me.
Yeah. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, I asked my readers if you could easily learn anything, how to do anything faster and more efficiently, what would it be and why? And I got answers across the board, everything from sharpshooting to learning languages to sex, which ironically you've addressed all of those before, but everything in between. So, but the majority of the answers focused on the 5 basic things that we would all, as moms, benefit from doing more efficiently, which were cooking, cleaning, organization, time management, and exercise. And you definitely address cooking really well in the 4 Hour Chef, but can you break down the process and how that could be applied to some of those other areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the key with reducing stress is reducing decisions. And there's been a lot of research that's been published in the New York Times and elsewhere, talking about decision fatigue. And in other words, if you're making decisions about small things all the time, you lose your ability to make good decisions about the big important things. And it affects willpower as well. So it's like if you force people, this has been done in experiments, where they have to, let's say, memorize numbers and then recite them later. And if you make them choose between, let's say, two different types of cookies in between, like their recall gets worse. It's pretty funny. So
Interesting.
Yeah, so what I would say is when it comes to, for instance, cleaning, uh, have a system that takes the any type of decision making out of it, any type of selection out of it. So what that means is, so Mehdi Chalawi was a private chef to Puff Daddy and Sean Combs, not sure what name he's going by now, and also worked at some of the top restaurants in the world. But when he cooked for Sean Combs, he had pretty much a regular sink, and he was like, all right, well, how do I take the process of cleaning in a restaurant and move it into the home? And what he realized is he would set them up very systematically. So, for instance, he might have a rule where all the silverware, I'm sorry, all of the cooking utensils are cleaned, like pots, pans, etc., are all cleaned by hand. All of the knives, forks, and eating portions, like plates and whatnot, are clean in the dishwasher, right? Just having that as instead of like washing a fork and then putting it in the dishwasher, then washing a plate and putting it in the dishwasher, then washing a pan and putting it in the dishwasher, rather than doing it in that kind of ad hoc fashion, he would have all of his plates, let's say, stacked on the left-hand side of the basin, and then he would quickly rinse them all with soapy water and put them in the sink. Wouldn't wash them off. And then he would turn on the water, rinse them all off, flip them upside down, and put them on the right hand side of the sink. And then he would do the same thing with the silverware. Then you have everything on the left hand side, on the right hand side of the sink, and then put it into the dishwasher. I know it sounds kind of silly, but there are a couple of different cleaning techniques in the book that literally can take it from like an hour down to 10 minutes. And it all has to do with just having a recipe for cleaning. You know, just like you have a recipe for cooking earlier in the meal, having a recipe for cleanup. That would be, and then there are other things like organization wise in the kitchen, like never using round containers, always using square containers, which saves like 40% of your space, things along those lines. But if we look at, let's say, exercise, so if I wanted someone to lose 20 to 100 pounds, the first thing that I would focus on if we're looking at fat loss, which is what most people are after if they're looking at exercise, I would actually say don't do any exercise at all. Because 95+% of fat loss is going to be diet, and it can be really easy. For instance, my dad lost 90 to 100 pounds. And the only thing I had him change the first month was I had him consume 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking up. So he would just have a protein shake. He used Myoplex. I use a powder that I can mix up, and his fat loss went from 5 pounds a month to 18.75 pounds per month as soon as he made that change. He didn't change anything else. It was just 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking up. And so it goes with everything else, time management, just having a method. Like if you go to Gmail or into the inbox and you're just kind of clicking around top, bottom, center in the inbox, doing things in a really ad hoc fashion, you're going to burn out your decision-making abilities. You're also going to waste a lot of time. So you would instead use something like Email Game, so emailga.me, which allows you to hit every email in order, never shows you the inbox. So you just progress sequentially through your whole inbox, has you timed, and it turns it into a game effectively where I routinely will cut my time in half for finishing my inbox and reaching inbox zero just by using Email Game. So there are a lot of elegant, perhaps non-obvious solutions to most of what causes headache in any given person's day.
I am making a note of email game because I get so many anymore.
Yeah. Email
Um,
is awesome, and Boomerang is great as well. Boomerang allows you to schedule follow-ups with people, so you don't have to worry about keeping track of who's responded to what. I also use Nudge Mail, Nudgemail. So, for instance, if I sent you an email and I didn't want to have to think about it again, but I was worried you might not get back to me, or I want to make sure you got back to me, I could just put in the BCC field like 3 days at nudgemail.com, and then in 3 days it'll ping me and remind me to look for your email if you haven't sent it. And Boomerang allows you to schedule emails to be sent later. So sometimes you get an email and you're like, I don't want to respond to this right now, or I don't want them to get my response right now. I want them to get my response like next Monday. So you just schedule it through Boomerang, and then you're good to go. So just really like to get all of those working in Gmail literally would take 5 minutes, and it would
wow,
take hours and hours, maybe dozens of hours a week.
that's great. So you talk a lot about doing the reverse or finding the path of least resistance, and you quote a coach who suggests doing as little as needed, not as much as possible. And I
Hmm.
know this is counterintuitive for a lot of us who have the voice of a parent or a mentor in the back of our head, telling us the benefits of hard work and putting in the time. And especially with exercise, I see this mentality a lot that it's the more the better, the more time put in, the more work at the gym, the better the results are supposed to be. So, can you talk a little bit more, especially with exercise and women? Because I know the ability to lose weight more efficiently would be huge for so many of us.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I have no problem with hard work if it's applied to the right things. The problem is it's typically not applied to the right things. So I encourage people to do perhaps the hard thinking up front, to pick the few things that give you the most leverage and then applying your time there, as opposed to just trying to brute force it with more hours. And I think the issue also is, like, it doesn't matter how effective a program is if you're not going to do it, right? So what women get brainwashed into believing through magazines and elsewhere is, like, if you're not putting in an hour or two at the gym, it's not even worth going to the gym. And therefore, if they go to the gym and they do 20 minutes, and then they, let's say, they have to pick up their kids at school the next day, or something pops up, and then they have to skip a day. So they've only gone to the gym now, 3 times for like a total of an hour. And yet they were hoping to go for an hour a day, and they're like, wow, I feel like a failure. Like, I should just not go to the gym. And it's really unfortunate, because you just don't need that much time at all. And in fact, there are many studies looking at how, for instance, even 5 minutes of cumulative high intensity exercise can be as beneficial as like 5 to 6 hours per week, from the standpoint of body composition and strength and everything else. So what I would say is, if you're going to the gym as a woman, first of all, and this is very counterintuitive because women are afraid of getting bulky and big, but don't worry about it, because you have 1/10 to 1/20th the testosterone of men. It's just a lot more challenging to get bigger in the first place. But resistance exercise is going to be the best return on investment. And that means weight training of some type, or kettlebells. So in the 4 Hour Body, I talk about something called the T-bar, which you can make it for like $10 at Home Depot. And you can make a kettlebell for yourself, which you can use for everything. Like, if you were to get, it depends obviously on your strength level, but let's say a 35-pound kettlebell, and that's it, and literally it almost fits in a shoebox. You have that at home, you never have to go to the gym. You just use that, do one set of swings 2 or 3 times a week, and the changes that you'll see will absolutely blow you away. I mean, you'll have like Michelle Obama arms in 2 weeks. It's really, it'll like literally lift your ass up. It does wonderful things to the female body. Hamstrings and legs just become incredible. And it's simple. It's straightforward. One set of, let's say, 25 to 50 swings, 3 times, probably 5 minutes of total exercise. And you'll just be astonished by the impact that it has.
Have you noticed, on a random note, are there any differences between what women and men should apply with all these different, especially fitness type things? Because I know, obviously, hormonally, we're going to respond differently. So, are there things that can be counterproductive for women?
Yeah, there are some things that can be counterproductive for women, but generally speaking, men and women should train exactly the same way. There are a few things that I would, and these are mostly aesthetic things, right? So from a health standpoint, they're pretty much identical. From an aesthetic standpoint, you find, for instance, like personal trainers who encourage women to do a lot of side bends and like hours and hours of side planks and stuff like that. And that's going to give you a blocky look. It's going to make you square, which I don't think most women want. I mean, speaking as a male, like, I love the hourglass physique, and I don't want to see, women lose that accidentally by taking bad advice. So, like, really working the obliques is completely unnecessary, and not, from an aesthetic standpoint, obviously subjective. I don't think it's a good idea. Doing a lot of really heavy, let's say, deadlift work or trap work. I mean, some guys might like really big necks on women. I don't think most guys do. But also something that a lot of personal trainers won't even take into account. So, you know, but I would say that, like, sitting on a stationary bike and like blistering your ass for 2 hours is not the way to get in shape. And that's what a lot of people will tell women, is they'll say, look, you need to do really low weights, really high reps. You need to do really low intensity, really long duration because you're a woman and men train differently. And it's total nonsense. It has no basis in fact. If you look at Marilyn Monroe, she lifted weights. I have photographs of her in the 4 Hour Body doing bench presses. And like
Yeah.
I don't think anyone would consider her manly.
Yeah, definitely not. So if you can you delve more into how the medium effective dose can be taught? I've personally used it with teaching my kids to read and teaching them math, but for many women, the ability to learn these things ourselves also brings the desire to be able to teach that to our family, to our kids. So like I've taught my kids the basics of reading with your tip on giving them the 100 most common words, and that
Yeah.
gives them the functional skills of reading. So
Cool.
even for those who don't necessarily have the desire to learn, 29 languages or learn how to swim, these are things we'd love for our children to be able to do.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I think that so to be a really good learner, to be the best learner possible, you have to be a good teacher. So if the motivation is to teach your kids how to do these things, that's beautiful and fantastic. But the best way that you will be able to teach those things is by learning about them. And I think that what I always try to do is make the content in the book that perhaps if you read it somewhere else would be very unappealing because it's super dry. Try to make it interesting. So it's like I have Calvin and Hobbes cartoons in the 4 Hour Chef. I have all sorts of entry points to keep things light and to keep things fun. And I think that in the process of looking at it, it will show you how I think adults and children are actually very, very similar. Children just are more transparent about what they find really boring.
Right.
And so, for instance, I mean, teaching through experience. I had wonderful parents, have wonderful parents, and what my mom did with me, for instance, is she never really pushed me in one direction or another, but she would expose me to a lot of things, and she would take me to the aquarium, which was free, or she'd take me to the beach to gather black sand with magnets, and I ended up wanting to be a marine biologist for 10 years, and I read every book on fish you could possibly imagine. And I think that children really thrive with anything that's sort of experiential, and much like adults, from what I've seen, kids really respond well to, depending on the age, of course, but to knowing why they're learning something. For instance, I refused to learn the alphabet until first grade, and my kindergarten teacher was a total, Gestapo. She made me eat soap, for God's sake, in class because I wouldn't learn the alphabet, which my mom, of course, was not very happy about. But in first grade, I had a great teacher named Mrs. Vinsky, and I was still being stubborn as hell and not learning the alphabet. And she came over to me at one point during a break, and she said, "Tim, do you realize that if you learn the alphabet, you'll be able to read books?" And I was like, "What? Why hasn't anyone told me this?" And then I did it in like 2 days. So I do think that by studying how to become a master learner yourself, how to become a master student yourself of life in general, you learn by default how to make your kids really curious about life and math and language and all of these things. So I think they go together really well.
Okay, so personally, I've used a lot of the principles you've talked about to maximize my own efficiency with blogging or, like I said, teaching my kids. And I'm also working on learning Italian just to see if I can do it since my husband speaks Italian.
Cool.
But I'm curious, what things in your own life have you used this process to maximize most efficiently, and what were your most effective experiments?
Oh boy, that's a great question. Well, a few. I mean, I grew up on Long Island, right on the water, and couldn't swim until a few years ago. 30 years of exposure to water, and I couldn't swim. Like I felt like I would sink, or I couldn't breathe properly, or whatever. I had all sorts of problems. I was also born premature, and have some lung issues. So I ended up coming across a method called total immersion, which I talk about, I sort of distill in the book, and in the 4 Hour Chef. And I literally went from a maximum of like 1 or 2 laps, miserable, like a horrible experience, but I could like gut out 1 or 2 laps if I had to calmly swimming like 20 to 30 laps at a time within the span of a week. And that blew my mind. That totally blew my mind. Like after 30 years of struggle, actually sitting down to think about it and look at this method and to try everything differently, right? So they always tell you with swimming, like, all right, grab a kickboard, start with your kicks, like kick, kick, kick. And I found it so exhausting and so miserable. Total immersion, no kicking, like practically no kicking. And it works beautifully. It's amazing. So that would be one. I never considered myself much of a dancer and applied this to Argentine tango at one point, which is a very difficult dance. And I was in Argentina at the time and ended up going to the World Championships 5.5 months later and set a world record. So can definitely be applied across the board. Language as well. I mean, you can really, if you go about it the right way, become conversationally fluent in a language in like 8 to 12 weeks. I mean, you really can. And like in the case of, let's say, Italian, if you combined a few things, looked at, let's say, Spanish as well, but Michelle Thomas, Michel, has amazing audio recordings that really open up the language that you can get through in about 6 to 8 hours. That's all you need. Viz Ed flashcards have high frequency words, so you can get them with bang for the buck. So vis-ed.com. It's a site called Duolingo, which is totally free and is just an incredible language learning tool. And I mean, you can really, instead of becoming world class in one or two things in your entire life, become world class in one or two things per year. And that changes how you look at everything.
Absolutely. Has there been anything you haven't been able to find that 20% for? Like, are there any things that you just do have to put in the hard work and the time?
Well, I think that you always want to apply intelligent effort to whatever you're doing, but all of the things that I thought I would never be able to get decent at or good at, like swimming, basketball was another one where I had a horrible experience as a kid where a junior high like PE teacher told me I dribbled like a caveman and that I should go back to wrestling, and I was like, oh man, just totally demoralized. And I was like, all right, like I'm not good at basketball. I'm never going to be good at basketball. And gave up on it forever. And then only in the process of the 4-Hour Chef, I was like, you know what? Like, if this process really works, I should be able to apply it to all the things that I thought were impossible for me personally. And I tried basketball, and boom, like in a weekend, I was shooting 3-pointers. It was crazy. So I really haven't found it because and this isn't something that I've invented really. I mean, these are like timeless principles that I've just put into recipe form that you can apply to looking at any skill differently. And I haven't found anything that it doesn't apply to.
Wow. So in the 4-Hour Chef, you talk about the importance of preparing food at home and using whole, natural, sustainable ingredients. And you mentioned wanting to start a 20 million person super trend, which you find
Yep.
would be the number needed to create the demand to make the changes in our food economy.
Yep.
So explain this and talk about what it would actually take to make this happen and why it's so important right now.
Well, I'll start with the last part. So of course I love teaching people. I want to have as much of an impact on people as possible, and I think learning is the best way to do it. But as far as the super trend goes, the reality in the U.S. right now is that something like 50% of independent farmers are set to retire in the next 10 years. And what that means is, independent and family-owned farmland in this country is basically going to be up for grabs in that period of time. So it could go to strip malls, it could go to huge industrial food corps like Monsanto that I tend to consider pretty evil.
Agreed, yeah.
And so if you look at, let's say, Mark Bittman, who writes for the New York Times and has written a bunch of cookbooks, very smart guy. And so he's identified this number, like 20 million people. You can change the behaviors and the thinking of 20 million people. You can create a super trend. And if you create that super trend, in my case, through 4-Hour Chef, then like if I could just get 20 million people to change their breakfast, right, or how they think about food, that would create the demand for these independent farmers so that it would be financially appealing for them to continue to run their farms. And I think that's really important to help this country to move from a few enormous industrial food suppliers to many individual farmers. I think that is really, if we want a sustainable future for ourselves and for our kids, we have to move that direction. And as a result, I'm going to be supporting the United States Farmland Trust and a number of different organizations, donating a lot of my royalties to these folks to help with preservation of farmland, among other things. But definitely the awareness is number one. And so like whether people buy the book or not is secondary, but getting people to really think about some of these questions to think about their ingredients, to think about natural food as opposed to engineered food, and so forth and so on. I think they're very, very critical conversations to the future of this entire country, and to the lives of our children and grandchildren, certainly. And I'm hoping to be a bit of a fly in the ointment to get people to talk about this stuff.
That's great. And I talk about that a lot on my blog too, and how a lot of people don't even think about it. They just eat for taste, but literally every meal you're either putting something that's benefiting your body or that's harming it, essentially.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Really encouraging people to focus on the ingredients that are going to build their body.
Yeah. No, and I mean, like, you are voting for the history of, you are voting for the future of this country and the future for your children with every meal that you eat, right? Like, look at your plate. What is that? Like, what are you voting for? Because I think that's a very smart, it's a very conscious way to look at it, but it's true. It's like, if you're spending money on food, you are supporting everything that goes behind that food. And what does that mean for 10 years down the line, you know?
Yeah. Okay, so as we wrap up, I ask the question they always ask in interviews. Who has been the most influential person in your life as you've learned about learning? And what resources would you point readers who want to learn more towards, besides obviously your books?
Ooh, boy. Well, most influential, I'd have to point to my mom. I mean, she just did a great job of getting me and my brother fascinated with the world in general, and just exposing us to a lot of things until we hooked onto something that we got really obsessively interested in. She just did a wonderful job at that. And I did not grow up wealthy. Both my parents worked, and never made more than 50 grand a year combined per year, but it was a really rich childhood, and that's led me to everything else. In terms of resources that I would point people to, and there's certainly other people in my life, but resources I would point people to, there's a video online. It's also on my blog. The blog is just 4-hour blog, FOURHOURBLOG.com. But Richard Feynman, Feynman, it was one of the most famous physicists of the last 100 years, and just a hysterical, awesome guy. And he's long since passed, but there's a video of him where he talks about, like, his dad teaching him and teaching his own son, called The Pleasure of Finding Things Out, which is just amazing. And it's free online. If you search it, or search on my blog, and it'll pop up right away. But The Pleasure of Finding Things Out is just awesome. It's really, really wonderful. Other resources that I might recommend for language learning, certainly Michel Thomas for many languages. Michel, that's a French man. He also passed away, but get the original recordings of him teaching students in real time. There's no note-taking, no writing involved. You just listen to the audio, and it's awesome. It's really amazing. Let's see. In terms of, let's say, dance or some of these other things, swimming, on the blog you can certainly find posts entirely free that will get you really well on your way with that stuff. And those are the first few that come to mind. And then, of course, I mean, the collection of everything that I know about learning and cooking is in the 4-Hour Chef, which is just 4hourchef.com.
Okay, so any final thoughts, important quotes, or things to leave us with?
Yeah, I would say that one of the most important realizations I've had in the last year or two, where sadly I've had a couple of friends, as you get older you see this, but I've had a couple of friends pass away, whether through sickness or accidents, things like that. Recognizing that, like, your time on this planet is finite, and the best way to sharpen the saw and get as much value out of this life for you and your loved ones is to accelerate your learning, to double your learning potential. And that's what I would leave people with.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much.